like a kid.
And get paid for your fantasies.
And I learned to do the Tarzan yell when I was a little kid playing with my cousin. She was always Jane.
Carol.
The audience was laughing. The cameras were rolling. And then came the moment that television executives reportedly did not want millions of Americans to see. That is what makes the Carol Burnett Show so fascinating. For 11 seasons, Carol Burnett turned a weekly variety show into one of television's biggest comedy institutions. She could make people laugh with a look, a costume, or a single line. But behind the bright lights was a constant battle over how far the show could go. And sometimes, the people in charge simply said no. Carol Burnett had a gift that made even risky comedy feel harmless. But some sketches pushed into subjects that network television was not comfortable showing. One famous example involved the show's satire of politics and current events, while other sketches tested standards involving language, costumes, and social taboos. The strange part is that Burnett's team often knew exactly what they were doing. They were not trying to shock people just for attention. They were trying to make audiences laugh at things that were normally considered too serious, too uncomfortable, or too controversial. And that raises an interesting question. If a joke made everyone laugh in rehearsal, but executives feared what would happen after it aired, who should have the final say? Let me know what you would have done. To understand why Burnett was willing to take those risks, we have to go back to the beginning, long before she became the woman millions knew simply as Carol. Burnett was born in San Antonio, Texas, in 1933. Her childhood was not the glamorous beginning you might expect from a future television legend. Her parents struggled with alcoholism, and her grandmother played an important role in raising her. But Burnett discovered something that could change everything. She could make people laugh. That talent became more than a hobby. It became an escape. As a young woman, Burnett moved toward New York and began chasing a career in entertainment. She performed in clubs and on television, slowly building a reputation for something unusual. She could be both incredibly funny and deeply human. Then came her breakthrough on The Gary Moore Show. Burnett's appearances made such an impression that she became a major television star. But she wanted something more than being the funny woman who appeared in someone else's show. She wanted her own stage. And in 1967, she got it. The Carol Burnett Show premiered on CBS. At first, nobody could know what it would become. But within years, it was no longer just another variety program. It was a television institution. And the bigger the show became, the more freedom Burnett had to experiment. That freedom would eventually create some of the most memorable comedy television had ever seen. But it would also put her directly against the people who controlled what America was allowed to watch. And one particular scene would show just how thin that line really was. The strange thing about the Carol Burnett Show was that the people making it were often trying to break the rules without looking like they were breaking the rules. That was part of Burnett's genius. She could take a serious subject, put it inside an absurd costume, add a ridiculous character, and suddenly millions of people were laughing at something they normally would never discuss at the dinner table. But there was a problem. CBS still had to approve what went on the air. And by the 1970s, network television had very clear limits. A joke could not simply be funny. It had to survive the network standards and practices department. That meant scripts were reviewed. Lines were questioned. Scenes could be changed. And sometimes, material that worked perfectly in rehearsal had to be softened before the cameras rolled. Burnett and her writers learned how to work inside those limits. Sometimes they even turned the limits themselves into part of the joke. But the pressure was real. The show was watched by families. Children were watching. Parents were watching. And CBS knew that anything controversial could bring complaints from viewers. Yet Burnett had something many performers did not have: enormous popularity. Her audience trusted her. They knew she could play a foolish housewife one minute and a glamorous movie star parody the next. They knew she could make fun of herself. And because she was so likable, she could sometimes get away with material another performer might never have been allowed to attempt. That balance became one of the show's greatest strengths. It also created some of its biggest risks. The writers were constantly looking for new ways to surprise the audience. And one of the most famous examples came from the show's political satire. Burnett and her team understood that politics was comedy gold. Politicians already provided strange speeches, strange behavior, and endless opportunities for parody. But there was a line. Make fun of a politician too gently, and the audience might not laugh. Push too hard, and suddenly the network could have a problem. That tension was everywhere in the show's production. And viewers rarely saw it. They saw the finished sketch. They did not see the meetings. They did not see the arguments. They did not see the material that was rewritten or removed. That hidden process is important because The Carol Burnett Show was not simply spontaneous comedy. Behind every ridiculous character was a team of professional writers, performers, producers, costume designers, and network executives trying to make one short sketch work. And sometimes, a sketch could be perfectly funny and still be considered too dangerous. This is where the story gets even more interesting. Because one of Burnett's greatest strengths was her willingness to make herself the target. She was not afraid to look ridiculous. She could wear an absurd costume, fall down, scream, sing badly on purpose, or play a character completely opposite to her real personality. That made the audience feel safe. They knew the joke was not always aimed at someone else. Sometimes Burnett was the joke, and that gave her freedom. But it also made the show's controversial moments more powerful. When a performer is clearly trying to hurt someone, audiences become defensive. When Burnett made herself look foolish while exposing the absurdity of a situation, viewers were more likely to laugh. That formula helped the show survive subjects that could have become uncomfortable. Still, not everything made it through. And this is the part many people forget. Television history is filled with scenes audiences never saw. Some were cut because of time. Some because of technical problems. Some because executives believed the material went too far. And some became legendary precisely because people knew they had been pulled back from the edge. By now, Burnett had become one of television's biggest stars. But success created a new problem. The more people watched, the more powerful the network's fear became. A controversial joke on a small program might disappear. A controversial joke on The Carol Burnett Show could become tomorrow morning's headline. And suddenly, the question was no longer simply, is this funny? The question was, is CBS willing to take the hit if millions of people complain? That question would become impossible to ignore. Because the next stage of Burnett's career proved that her biggest battles were not always with her fellow performers. Sometimes, the real battle was happening in the room nobody watching at home could see. And during the show's most successful years, that battle was about to get much more intense. Before we reveal the moment that became one of the clearest examples of how far Burnett's comedy could go, make sure you stay with the story, because what happened behind the cameras explains why some of her most daring comedy feels almost impossible to imagine on network television today. But there really was one CBS note that stood out, and Carol Burnett herself later talked about it. It involved a sketch about a nudist colony. At first, the idea sounds almost too harmless to cause trouble. Burnett played a woman behind a fence, dressed in a way that suggested she was nude, while Harvey Korman's voice came from off-screen as he interviewed her about life in the colony. The jokes were silly. Nothing seemed dangerous. Then came the question about the Saturday night dance. Burnett's original punchline was considered too blue by the network, so CBS demanded that she change it. Burnett later recalled that this was essentially the one major note she remembered receiving during the show's 11-year run. And that detail tells us something important. The network was not constantly fighting Burnett. In fact, according to Burnett, CBS generally left the show alone. That freedom was unusual. Think about it. One of the biggest television networks in America gave a comedy show enormous room to experiment. Burnett and her writers could create strange characters, outrageous costumes, political parodies, relationship jokes, and physical comedy without executives rewriting every line. But even that freedom had a boundary, and sometimes the smallest line could cross it. The nudist sketch is a perfect example because the problem was not what viewers might expect. It wasn't actual nudity. It wasn't a dangerous stunt. It wasn't some shocking political attack. It was a joke. One sentence. That was enough for someone at CBS to step in. And there is an important difference between saying a scene was banned and saying a line was censored or changed. The famous nudist sketch itself did air, The network simply required Burnett's original punchline to be replaced. That distinction matters, because stories about old television can easily become exaggerated over time. A joke gets changed, and years later it becomes CBS banned the whole scene. But the real story is actually more interesting. Burnett had created a show powerful enough to operate with remarkable creative freedom, yet even she could not completely escape the rules of network television. And there were other moments when the show's comedy became much more daring. One of the biggest examples was Went with the Wind. Burnett played Starlet O'Hara, a ridiculous parody of Scarlett O'Hara, complete with an enormous dress. Then came the reveal. The bottom of the dress was completely destroyed. Instead of looking glamorous, Burnett's character looked as though she had survived a disaster. The audience exploded. Burnett later remembered knowing the sight gag would get a huge laugh. CBS News has described the famous costume as one of the show's iconic moments, and Burnett said she knew the gag was going to be one of television's great sight jokes. That sketch shows why Burnett was so effective. She wasn't afraid to destroy her own image. She could be glamorous, then ridiculous, elegant, then completely foolish. And because she was willing to laugh at herself, audiences trusted her. But that trust did not mean everything was safe. The show also contained material that modern audiences may find uncomfortable, especially sketches involving racial stereotypes and outdated ideas about gender and sexuality. Modern reviews have pointed out that some of those performances have not aged well. So the real story of censorship on The Carol Burnett Show is more complicated than a simple battle between an artist and a cruel network. Sometimes CBS said no. Sometimes Burnett and her writers found another joke. And sometimes they pushed forward and created television history. That balance helped the show survive for 11 seasons. But eventually something even bigger would happen. Burnett would reach a point where she had achieved almost everything a television comedian could dream of. And yet she still had to decide when enough was enough. For the viewers at home, the show seemed effortless. Behind the curtain, it was anything but. And that hidden struggle may be the most revealing part of Carol Burnett's story. That freedom was one of the reasons The Carol Burnett Show became so special. Carol Burnett was not simply the star standing in front of the camera. She had helped build a format where comedy, music, costumes, celebrity guests, and sketches could all exist in the same hour. And she knew exactly what made it work: the audience. Burnett famously began each show by talking directly with people in the studio. Those conversations made viewers feel as if they knew the real woman behind the characters. She was not distant. She was not untouchable. She felt like someone you could sit beside. That connection became incredibly important when the comedy became risky, because audiences were willing to follow Burnett almost anywhere. But there was another reason the show could take chances. Burnett was surrounded by performers who understood timing at an extraordinary level. Harvey Korman could turn a tiny reaction into a joke. Tim Conway could barely say a line without making the entire cast struggle to keep from laughing.